Bishop Pete, good afternoon. It's good to see you.
Good afternoon. Nice to see you too.
And I was going to say congratulations on your retirement, but you haven't really retired, I don't think, have you? Is that fair?
Not really. No, I've stopped being Bishop of Willesden, but I'm doing other jobs for the Diocese of London, which is quite a useful thing to be able to hand on some of the accumulated things that I know about in the diocese. So it's a good year's worth of job.
Great. Well, that's excellent. Well, thanks very much for agreeing to this sort of, I don't want to say interview really, YouTube conversation, but just to have a little think. We've got a new quinquennium of General Synod about to start, and lots of new members, and we thought it might be quite helpful if you could give them a bit of a sort of top 5 tips for surviving on Synod or something along those lines. But just to begin, really, I mean, you clearly served on General Synod for a long time. When did you first join General Synod, and how has it changed over the years?
I was first elected in 1985, so I'm back in the Stone Age, really. And I was on Synod all that time, apart from about 3 years when I transitioned from being an archdeacon to a bishop and got kicked off and then had to be re-elected because you change houses from clergy to bishops. How's it changed? I think it's got more informal. I mean, it's mirrored in many ways what society and everything else has become, in the sense that when we first started, it was pretty much formal set piece stuff at one level. We had speeches which lasted 10 to 15 minutes and lots of eminent theologians. We were also in quite a big cycle of liturgical reform when I first started. So there was quite a lot of that business going on, that dominated things. And then, of course, we moved on to the various bits of legislation to ordain women first as bishops, first as priests and deacons, and then as bishops. So that's a shift in terms of the kind of ethos, a shift in terms of the sorts of folk who stand, I think, because there are probably fewer people who give their time to it now from the theological world, which more's the pity, and probably a greater degree of activists around the place, people who come with a cause that they want to promote.
Sure. Is that in terms of Synod members being activists, or people sort of operating on? I mean, you might say a little bit about something I've never really understood about is fringe events at synods and that sort of thing.
Yeah, well, they have fringe meetings, which they haven't obviously happened recently because of the pandemic. But what we'd normally have is a kind of series of stalls and sideshows and fringe meetings where particular organizations can promote the things they're doing for the mission of God and try and get people signed up to them. And there's a whole diversity of different sorts of things, from social action to campaigning groups, etc. So yeah, that's obviously around. No, I think there's also the thing that people in this particular synod election were standing particularly to define themselves on the whole question of LGBTI plus inclusion. And there was that little ripple of stuff from Save the Parish too, which was a pressure group that sprung up fairly recently. So I think, but there are also lots of people just put themselves forward because they feel they're called by God to serve, and that's the most important thing.
Sure, no, absolutely, no, thank you. So I mean, obviously, 1985. I mean, first time on Synod. I mean, it's a long time, and you mentioned some things there. You mentioned liturgical reform and the various bits of legislation to enable women to be ordained to the diaconate, priesthood, and episcopacy. Momentous moments, really. But for you, what was the most memorable moment on Synod, and what was the most frustrating?
The most memorable one was undoubtedly the women priest legislation going through. Everyone on both sides of the debate was on tenterhooks. Those were the days when we had all our votes by being counted through the doors, a bit like Parliament does. And so standing outside, having voted and trying to work out whether there were enough people for the sufficient 2/3 majority in each of the 3 houses. And of course, you'll know it squeaked in, I think, by 2 votes in the House of Laity. And that was very tense. Very difficult because there were going to be winners and losers, but also amazingly exciting because we were making history, and we knew we were making history if the vote went through. A very joyful moment for some, a time for desolation for others. So quite dramatic, really.
Yeah.
What was the more frustrating? I think the frustrating things have been where we've taken a long time to do things that we knew we had to do but didn't get it right first time. And there were some very tedious bits of debate where people were overzealous in terms of trying to protect their corner, and it took a long time for things to go through. Synod process can be dreadful when it's at its worst. We have streamlined quite a lot of it. You'll probably know I've been a great champion for simplification of many of our procedures.
Sure. So I do want to ask you a little bit about the vote on the women to the episcopacy, and obviously the first time it fell, and then it obviously came back in 2014, I think. And there was this famous thing. I hope you don't mind me mentioning. Of do you agree with Pete, or I agree with Pete, or something? Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
It was a very funny moment in time, really. I mean, we were desperate to get something which would satisfy everybody in terms of opponents wanting to make good provision, which is what then became the 5 guiding principles, etc. And I didn't know quite how to make it work. And I had a kind of conversation with a few people in the bar. And I said, look, if I get up and make a speech suggesting that what we do is we devise a revision committee, which is equally people who are in favour of the ordination of women to the episcopate and those against, which is not how we'd normally do it. If you agree that that's a way forward, then will you please slot into your speech, I agree with Pete. And we had this rather odd morning when everyone was making speeches and saying, look, they think it is the way forward, and they slotted these key words in, apart from Archbishop Justin, who took us all by surprise by saying, I don't agree with Pete. Actually, he did, but he was taking the mickey. But it did change the course of the debate, and we managed to break the log jam and move on. And what came out of it is the whole concept of mutual flourishing and the 5 guiding principles. I hope which work. I think there are some people who don't think it does very well, but it certainly got the legislation through in a better way and a better settlement than we might otherwise have done.
Sure. No, that's great. That's a great story. So, as you mentioned, new members of Synod. What do you know now that you wish you'd known when you started?
Oh golly, I mean, it was difficult for me because I was a local authority councillor, so I was used to reading volumes of paper. But I think there is that sort of question about what you read and how assiduously you read it. You will find yourself deluged, not these days with paper, but with stuff sent to you, which you can either print out or not. There's a Synod app, which is very useful, which you ought to download to your phone, which enables you to read all the stuff. But I think getting on top of the business and trying to work out how it all operates is very important. You will find that the business committee run a very helpful introductory session which tell people how to organize themselves and what the different bits of paper mean, or the different bits of virtual paper, if you like. So getting on top of the paper is important. Trying to think your way through how the agenda works. You will find that each day there are set items of business, but the important thing to look at is a thing called the order paper, which is issued morning and afternoon, and which tells you what business is being taken in what order and numbers all the business. And it's worth paying attention to that. And that you also find on the Synod app. Because what happens is, although we have stuff that's timetabled for debate, things can move around quite a lot in how the agenda is ordered. So be alert to what's going on. Get on top of the things. There are basically 2 or 3 categories. There are GS papers, which are the main papers we debate. There are GS MISC papers, which are usually background to what's going on. And there are notice papers, which give you additional information, and they're published every day, and which try to tell you what's happening. So you have those 3 sorts of papers, and then the order paper, which enables you to digest it all. And sometimes there are also background reports, which are produced specially and printed in glossies, and they need to be read as well. So read the stuff, marshal it, order it. I always found it very helpful just to keep it in the numerical order of the GS numbers, because then you can cross-refer it. But people find their own ways of dealing with it. And be aware that something that's timetable for one day may move to a different day. So you have to be alert to the fact that you might need different papers from ones you thought you had.
Sure. That's fascinating. Well, thanks ever so much. Now, I didn't stand for Synod, but I read a lot of candidate selection addresses, and it was great to have so many people standing, certainly in London, but I think in lots of dioceses. Clearly, what came across to me is that people are, and you've already alluded to this, people are passionate about certain issues in the Church of England, and they're standing on certain platforms. But obviously, I assume that the agenda set by the business committee and so on. So, what you obviously starting Synod, there are certain issues on that you're passionate about. But what can a new member of Synod hope to achieve over 5 years? Or in other words, how can they best make a difference?
Well, how do you contribute? Well, I mean, obviously, the main thing people do is speak and debate. And what we find in Synod is there are loads of people with huge expertise, which we didn't even know about, who can bring that to a debate. That's quite important. You can put down motions and amendments. You can ask questions. You can even put down a private member's motion if you want to try and get things done. But the most important thing is to be attentive and listen to how the debate's going in the chamber. It's quite a polite assembly most of the time. And so there's an attentiveness to what's going on. You'll find the chairs will try and call people who are for and against in different ways. If you're a first-time speaker, then put yourself down to say that this is a maiden speech, and that might well get you called. But see where your expertise lies and how you contribute. And do all that in a spirit of prayer. There's a lot of prayer takes place, both set prayer in terms of liturgical stuff and informal praying presence as well, because we're a Christian assembly and we try and do these things as well as we can in terms of a spirit of prayer. But I think it's listen to what's going on. Talk to the people who sit around about you. I say people are quite friendly and they'll brief you on the nuances of what's being said. And listen to where the debate is going and try and weigh what's going on. If you've been on a Diocesan Synod, you'll be familiar with some of that, but it's slightly more intense in General Synod.
Sure. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Well, it's obviously an exciting time to go into Synod for people in the beginning of a new quinquennium. Now, obviously, I'm an ecclesiastical lawyer. This is the Ecclesiastical Law Society website. Synod is the legislative body for the Church of England. It's the place, obviously, where laws are made. So this, if you don't mind, just as we sort of come to an end, I'm going to give a little bit of a plug, and that we very much hope that new Synod members will join the Ecclesiastical Law Society, get a copy of the Ecclesiastical Law Journal 3 times a year, and there's various conferences and so on, as well as, in particular, we've got a day conference, which I think you're speaking at, Bishop Pete, on the 2nd of April, right, in London on the history, past, present, and future of synodical government. So obviously, we hope you agree that the ELS is a good thing to join, but also, in addition to the ELS, what advice do you have for new members who are maybe feeling a little bit nervous about the legislative legal aspects of Synod?
Well, the number one thing is don't bunk off to the tea room when legislative business comes on. It obviously is quite complicated. We have this huge privilege. We can make effectively law of the land by passing measures and canons. And Parliament, who get quite miffed about this, can't actually amend the substance of what we send. They can only accept or reject it. Now, that's a huge privilege that we've got under the various measures that set up both the Synod and its predecessors. So be involved in the fact that we are making law which stands for the Church of England over the coming years. Yes, there are minutiae. There are people on Synod who are very, very good at picking through the legislation and what it means and the possible knock-on effects of making a law and whether it will make a difference in your parish. But please don't tune out. It's perhaps the most important thing we do is legislation because it's the one thing that stands definitively. We might think that having debates about matters and topics of concern are important, and they are. And so obviously talking about the plight of refugees or something else which is a major social issue is important. But the legislative stuff is really worthwhile. And if you can cock an ear to it and try and listen to what's going on and perhaps talk to some of the folk who are fairly obviously people who know what the legislative nuances of a thing are, you'll find it quite helpful. And again, that's one where you have to listen to the debate and weigh the arguments, because quite often a legislative debate is about, do we include something in a measure which will do this or not? Listen to the way in which it's going and vote accordingly. So I mean, I'm an amateur lawyer. I haven't got any of your expertise at all, but I've always wanted to follow legislation. I've always said to my colleagues, particularly clergy, if you don't like legislation, just think that you need to know that it governs you. And if you want to work round it or through it or with it, you need to know what it says. So I'm an absolute fan of people getting their heads around the legal stuff that Synod produces.
Sure, that's great. And final question. I remember when the Archbishop of York two ago, I think, David Hope, retired and he went back to becoming a parish priest in Ilkley. I remember one of the things he said was, "There's one thing I will not miss is General Synod." What about you, Bishop Pete? Are you going to miss it, or after all this time, are you pleased? Are you pleased to be done? Do you think?
Well, I'll obviously miss it at one level hugely, because I've made lots of friends there, and lots of us, have good social interaction. We even had a bar fellowship at one stage of my time on Synod with a group of people who always drank together. People go out for meals, try and find other people who are around the place to network with. So I shall miss that social side. I think I've done my bit. The fact is, you can't go on these things forever. You need to hand over. We have lost quite a few people, as you mentioned earlier, who have been around for quite a long time. So the new intake have got plenty of potential and possibility. So I'll miss it, but it's not my time anymore. We're handing on the baton to other people and look after the important things the church does through Synod.
Thank you. Well, Bishop Pete, thanks ever so much for this conversation, and certainly on behalf of the Ecclesiastical Law Society, I would say to all those who are newly elected to Synod, we wish you all the very best. Do join the society, and we're here to help, and all the very best for the new quinquennium. Bishop Pete, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Stephen.